Hey everybody, welcome back to the So We Speak podcast. This is Cole Fakes. I'm joined by Terry Fakes as usual. And we are wrapping up a little series of podcasts here on contemporary issues that you and I have found interesting, talking about several things that have been on our minds, some of them in the wake of the Weekly Speak, which came back this week, some of them just in the rapid change of our culture and things that we thought would be worth talking about from a Christian worldview.
I do think the pace of change recently, particularly this episode that we're getting ready to do, I think the pace of change has made everybody a little nervous and just unsettled. And I think it's a good time to talk about how we deal with those things.
Well, let's kick off this topic. I've included in the notes here a list of resources, some of which we'll mention, some of which we're going to dissect on the podcast today, but they all basically have to do with this topic of distraction, dopamine, discipleship. And I want to lead off with what I thought was an insightful article by Martin Saunders called Why Your Smartphone Might Be Stopping You from Following Jesus. So, to kick it off, true or false, your smartphone might be keeping you from following Jesus.
Well, I think that's true, even though he will admit that the smartphone has made it easy to read the Bible anywhere you are, anytime. The problem is it's also made it easy to scroll through social media anywhere at any time.
Yeah, it's been a Pandora's box. There's been good things, there's been
Hmm.
bad things. It's the Bible is more accessible than it's ever been before. YouVersion, things like that, different apps that you
Right.
can use. Amazing. I have a Bible reading plan with some guys at our church that we read on YouVersion every day. It's a great way that you can all comment, highlight, copy and paste. I love that part of it. However, I think what we're getting at is kind of what this article is aiming at, which is an analysis of Jonathan Haidt's book called The Anxious Generation, which is to say, what are the general effects of cell phones, smartphones, social media on us as human beings, beyond just is it good or bad to read your Bible on an app? What is the liturgy of your phone doing in your life? And of course, Jonathan Haidt's point is the effects of social media specifically and smartphones more generally on teenagers specifically
Right.
is extremely detrimental to the point that I really don't know that this is even a live discussion anymore. I have followed that some of the pushback on Jonathan Haidt's book is that there's maybe more correlation than causation on social media and the effects it has on anxiety and depression. I I have to say I find that very difficult to believe that this is not being triggered in a lot of ways by social media. Now, could there be other causes as well? Sure. But as we're going to get to later in the episode here, one of the things that's a proof for me is not just the causation in the data, it's the causation in the treatment. Getting people
Right.
off of social media is one of the things that's proven the best way to rid young people of symptoms of anxiety and depression. So to me, that's another blow to this. Well, maybe it's other things. It pretty much is the correlation is between social media use early in life, anxiety and depression, social difficulties, lower mental health, all these things
Uh-huh.
flow from the same source. And so you look through this article and you say, is it just our young people that are having a hard time with this, or could we maybe be included in this same thing?
Yeah, I think you're right. We are also included, maybe to a lesser extent, because we use it a little bit less. I mean, as you get older, you tend to have lower percentage of people that have adopted and embraced smartphones. But the scrolling phenomenon, if nothing else, is universal, and I know we'll get into that in a little bit. So I do think it's applicable to everyone.
Well, two of the things that he points out that I thought were notable in this article is the effects of smartphones and social media on all of us is that it's caused us to have attention fragmentation, basically unending distraction, constant states of distraction in our life. And then what he's going to talk about is phone addiction, which maybe we'll nuance a little bit here as we get through the episode. But the state of distractedness was the first thing that caught my interest. And what I thought was unique about this article is he uses a biblical picture to talk about this when it comes to our discipleship. He talks about the story of Mary and Martha, but if you substitute the things that Martha was doing around the house for being on her phone, it immediately becomes a very modern parable
Right.
for our time. Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus, and Martha is checking Instagram, scrolling, standing at the counter, or
Right.
everybody's talking, and Martha is checking her text messages.
She's
That
live tweeting the
really,
event.
she's
Yeah.
live tweeting it. Yeah, she's recording it. Jesus is here, taking selfies, posting them on her story. That really struck me as, okay, if you were to transport this story into the modern day, how would the
Hmm.
force hit us? Well, Jesus might say, "Hey, Martha, yeah, that's great and all, but one thing is needful. Mary has chosen the better path to be personally engaged, free from distraction." And that story in the Bible and in this kind of modern telling are basically parables of discipleship. Our discipleship is
Right.
central on the focus, the undivided attention and focus we have with Jesus. And our phones are maybe in some ways the biggest detractor from that. So I remember years ago there was a book called Having a Mary Heart in a Martha World,
Hmm.
talking about single-mindedness in a world of distraction. That maybe that's the moniker of how you treat your phone, is how do you have Mary kind of focus in a Martha screen time distraction kind of world.
I do think that's the essential challenge, and it opens up a couple of doors. One is the idea of distraction, and that's the avoidance of boredom. But it also essentially distracts us from being able to think deeply about anything. And so you've seen a wide variety of things come out as deep work. The idea of productivity happens when you can focus on one thing and immerse yourself in it. So this idea of distraction, but even beyond that is the idea of addiction. And I think you can use your phone as a distracting mechanism to avoid boredom. But I also think there are people who are addicted to the dopamine hit. So I think maybe there are two phenomena going on here. What's your thinking on the connection there?
Well, I think the distraction idea is probably hits home for most people, and we are living in a world that wants us to be distracted. In
Hmm.
fact, one of the articles that we'll link to is Ted Gioia's State of the Culture, which I've put on the Weekly Speak now a couple of times because I think it's a really important look at where we are as a culture. His basic thesis, the state of the culture in 2024, is previously art, high art, think paintings, films, symphonies, have been replaced with entertainment. So this would be
Right.
lower forms of art or things that require less knowledge, less specialization, less time to enjoy. And so
Hmm.
instead of long movies that really require you to think and be a part of to enjoy, now we've got TV shows that you can get in 22 minutes, and you can binge watch the whole thing instead of
Right.
having to wait and enjoy. So his thesis is that entertainment has killed art, but now something is killing entertainment. And the thing that's killing entertainment is distraction. And he tells a couple of stories, we probably all experienced this, of people who go to a movie. So he has somebody comment that somebody goes to see Dune 2, which is, like a 3 hour movie.
Right.
And the person sitting in front of them literally scrolls on their phone through the entire movie. So, what used to be the diversion, the movie, you go see the movie to
It's a
be
diversion.
entertained.
Yes.
Now you need a diversion from the entertainment, which he calls distraction, or which he calls dopamine culture. So the dopamine, and at this point, not using dopamine necessarily in its ultra technical sense, but using it in the
Hmm.
sense of we are addicted to the short burst of dopamine, of pleasure, that comes from things like alerts on your phone, scrolling, likes, all that the tech world is built to give you. The addiction to those short-term pops of pleasure, as opposed to the longer term slow release pleasures that come from things like art and entertainment. So he thinks, interestingly, we have a whole market now that's created to make us distraction and dopamine addicts. And so he goes through the
Right.
culture to show, like he has a great chart on here, going from the classical culture to the modern culture to the dopamine culture. And an example would be something like playing a sport, as the peak of
Right.
enjoyment is kind of classical culture. Watching a sport on TV is entertainment culture. Gambling on sports is dopamine culture, right? So it's not the
Yes.
playing, you're not physically a part of it anymore, but you're not even content with watching it. You need the immediate gamification hit of gambling on it to see on this play or in this part, did I get something? Um,
Right.
which I think is, and he goes through maybe 6 or 7 different things on this, but I think that was the easiest one to conceptualize. And his point basically about the whole culture is the tech companies that basically make social media apps that make your phone, that are fueling this, they want to create a world of junkies because they intend to be the dealers,
Right.
which I thought was a really great way of putting it. They would love for us to spend more and more time on their apps, on their phones, because that's the way they make money. And when you look at things like, the paradox, he mentions the paradox of dating apps, for example. Dating apps present themselves as a pathway for you to find a partner. But the
Right.
business model of the dating app is based on you not finding a partner.
Right. That you
The
continue
dating
to
app
date.
needs as
Right.
many people on the app as possible. And they need you on there as much as possible. But they
Hmm.
purport that their mission is to get you off of the app because you find you're happily ever after. And that perfectly captures the market of the dopamine culture.
That is a great illustration. And once he starts uncovering these things, you go, "Aha! Yes, he's right," and you see it everywhere. I was particularly impressed when he talked about entertainment is dead because at first I thought, I don't know about that. I think entertainment's getting stale. There's not a lot of new stories, new movies. We're into Fast and Furious 10 and Born number 6 and uh, an Iron Man number 24, et cetera. So I bought that. But then as he went on to talk about how poorly television uh, is doing, how the Disney studios are losing money because entertainment itself is being killed by what we've turned ourselves into. It's almost a Greek tragedy in the sense that we tend to think of, and I would be interested to know what you think about this, because we consider technology to be progress. However, if you look at technology as he defines it and the road that we're on, you can see that it doesn't seem to have our welfare in mind. It simply is a way to make money and continue this cycle. And that mindless cycle of making money isn't really for our good.
Hmm. Well, to give an example of what you just mentioned, I saw this morning in the Wall Street Journal that Disney reported their earnings yesterday, and their losses in their theme parks are being supported by the gains in their streaming business,
Hmm.
which, I'm not going to base this all on
Wait,
one earnings report, but it totally follows the trend
right,
that people are leaving the experience, the true experience. I mean, that used to be the ultimate vacation was to get to go to Disney World. But now it's
right,
like, well, why go to Disney World when you can watch Disney Plus, on
right,
TV? You don't even have to leave your house, and you don't even have to get up, and that's the phenomenon. And so the question that you're posing is that the good life, or does that lead to the good
right.
life? And I think the
Is
thing
that
that's really interesting from a Christian perspective is, what are we missing as Christians if we participate in that vision of the good life? Because in some ways it's inescapable. I mean, I'm not saying that we need to go Amish and get rid of all technology and get
right?
out of the dopamine culture. Um, but what are we missing if we if we indulge in it? And we had mentioned before, a really interesting philosopher, Byung-Chul Han, has a book called The Burnout Society. And one of the things that he talks about is the technological promise is something like you'll be able to multitask, you'll be able to do
Right,
anything. There's a limitlessness of technology, which has not proven to be true. People, we have technology at our fingertips now that people could not have imagined 50 years ago, and yet we work more than they do and we're less happy.
right,
But the promise is limitlessness, multitasking. And he makes this really clever point. I thought multitasking is not something that's a sign of progress, it's a sign of regress. Multitasking is what animals do in the state of nature. They
right,
eat and look for predators at the same time, and they've evolved that way to basically suit that need. He says we owe the cultural achievements of humanity, which include philosophy, he's a philosopher, to deep contemplative attention. Culture presumes an environment in which deep attention is possible. I'd love to just copy and paste that quote over to
Right.
spiritual growth. Spiritual growth presumes an environment in which deep attention is possible. What do you think about that?
I think historically, first of all, that's true. You see the development of philosophy and science when humanity got to the point that they had leisure time. In other words, when you move beyond subsistence and you get into leisure time, then you see the philosophy and the science of the ancient Greeks, et cetera, is it takes leisure for that. We've basically gotten in this achievement productivity mindset, which is our cultural driver. And that says leisure time is effectively bad because you could be producing something.
Mm-hmm.
And so another quote from Byung-Chul Han is that our achievement society is turning into a doping society because we actually aren't able to be bored or to have leisure. And I think his argument is that's a regression. We will
Mm-hmm.
lose the key elements of our culture that can only come from deep thinking.
There's a biblical precedent for this in that the Israelites were commanded by God to limit
Right,
production. Of course, I actually think they saw this differently than we. It's hard for us to imagine the mindset of people before the Industrial Revolution. However, even if we were to transport our vision of things back to them, kind of everyday life, you work and then you have a Sabbath every week. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. You must
right,
limit your productivity. You have 7 big feasts a year. I mean, if you add this up, these people are not working, for dozens of days every year, in addition to the
right.
Sabbaths, because God has commanded them to feast, to give things like the first fruit away to God, which is the fruit of your
Hmm.
productivity. If you think about even in the New Testament, so much of what Jesus and his disciples are doing is centered around these feast days where there's everybody gathered together in Jerusalem, or they've gone to friends' homes and Jesus is teaching. There is something to be said that the Bible actually requires us to limit what could otherwise be productive time
Right,
to be at rest, active rest, things that are contemplative, things that are celebratory, joyous. This isn't saying that the Sabbath is just intended for us to sit in front of the TV. There's other
right,
things we can do with it. But, another Old Testament parallel would be like in the story of Ruth, where Boaz is following the Old Testament laws of not reaping to the very end of his fields.
right,
Well, if Boaz had shareholders, they'd be saying,
right,
Where's that extra 10% that we could reap from the edge of the fields? What's going on here? We need to optimize for productivity. But
right.
God had forbidden them to do that, to remember the sojourner and the foreigner. There's a pattern in the Bible, not of lack of productivity, but limiting
Limiting
productivity
it. Right.
so that we can have these times of rest and Sabbath and Jubilee. Um, and I think there's strong implications for us in this productivity digital dopamine age to say, where are you not reaping to the edge of your fields? You may not have like a series
Right.
of feast days through the year, but do you have anything like that that is stepping back from and out of the all out productivity culture? Do you have things like that with your phone? Times that you
Right.
could be on it, but you're not, where you just sit there, in a waiting room like a weirdo, just looking around, thinking to yourself, as opposed to being on your phone like the other people that are there.
Right. Well, what do you think about what you just said? Let's apply that to discipleship. In other words, do you see that us taking that mode of living in which we're all engrossed, we're not in a you must take weekends off. We're in a you don't have to work on the weekends if you don't want to. But if you want to maximize productivity, you will. In other words, taking that and move it to our spiritual lives. How do you see that as a detrimental thing in our spiritual lives and our discipleship?
Well, I think so much of discipleship actually does come from things that don't have an immediate productive end.
No
Uh,
dopamine hit, sort of.
yes, so part of our growth as Christians is spending time in the Word. That's something that you can make productive if you want to. Praying is something that you can try to make productive if you want to. But even in those activities, if you view it that way,
Hmm.
you are really not going to grow. You're not going to grow.
Right.
The way that you read for growth and the way that you read to check it off your list are two very different things. So taking the time to read for communion with God, enjoyment with God, certainly learning to pray in a way that is more than just, I've got to get these things into God because if they don't get stamped, you know, 3 to 5
Right.
business days later, they can't get answered. That's just not the way God works.
Right.
You pray so that you can commune with God. In fact, we could go back to the Han quote here and say, we owe the cultural achievements of humanity. Maybe we put this, we owe the cultural achievements of our own growth, our own religious growth, to deep contemplative attention.
Hmm.
That's actually what so much of the Christian life consists of, is deep contemplative attention with God or with other people without any real immediate end in sight. Doing the thing for the sake of doing it, as opposed to doing the thing for the sake of what you'll get from doing it, is central to the Christian life. And it goes through all the, when you look at the spiritual gifts in the New Testament, when you look at the fruits of the Spirit, these things are not part of an exchange. They're worth doing just for the sake of doing those things. Those things are their own reward. And I think we need to step back every now and then and think, is there anything in our spiritual life that we're doing like that?
Yes. I sometimes ask, is there anything in our culture that is an end in itself? And in our culture, not much. Most things that we do are means to some other end, but that's not true in discipleship. The reading of our Bible is not a means to an end. It is an end in and of itself for what God is going to do with it. And I think that's a hard mind shift to make from our day-to-day business life into our spiritual life. So I do think that this is a valid point and something we need to pay attention to, that the distraction and the preoccupation can seep into our discipleship, and we're just impatient with it.
There's a lot of discussion right now, kind of building off of this, to get phones out of schools. So Jonathan
Mm,
Haidt is big on this. In fact, in Oklahoma recently, there's a law. I think the law is still being debated, but I think some school districts have now made their own rules to prohibit schools. So I got an article on here that Bixby Public Schools, for example, is prohibiting cell phone use at school. The reason for this is the statistics are unbelievable in student achievement and happiness when they get their phone out of the classroom. So you check your phone in early in the
right.
day, or it's got to be in your backpack. Whatever it is, you're not allowed to have your phone at school. This is becoming something that I think in the next 3 to 5 years we'll see be the norm, certainly
Hmm.
in certain sectors, so whether that be certain parts of the country, certain private schools, Christian schools. I think certain big districts that adopt this may provide a cascade across public schools, but I think we're going to see it build momentum. And I think part of the reason is there's been a pullback on technology post COVID. Uh, the ability of students to learn through digital tools and mediation is just not what it is otherwise. And I'm not saying that there aren't great ways to do activities online,
Right.
different ways to learn online, but just most of your education being on a screen mediated that way, as opposed to mediated in the rough and tumble of a teacher in a classroom and everybody's
Right.
engaging and talking and interacting with each other, has proven that better learning outcomes come from less technology. So it reminded me of Neil Postman and his book Amusing Ourselves to Death, which was so prophetic, whatever it is, 40 years ago now.
Yeah.
And he was talking about TV, which just shows you how long ago this was. He was
Right.
talking about, can TV ever be a medium of education? And he says no. Even if you're watching something like the Discovery Channel and you feel like you're getting an education on something, you're not really getting all that you think you are, because the medium of TV is a medium of entertainment.
Right.
So everything you do on there is going to be entertainment themed. Even if you're collecting some great facts, you're not becoming a better learner by doing it on TV. I would say if he were writing this today, what he would say is phones, and I would include iPads probably in this too, are
Hmm.
mediums of restlessness. They're mediums of scrolling. They're mediums of dopamine hits. Therefore, you might learn something on a phone, and I think we all
Right.
have, with reading articles, doing whatever, but you're not becoming a better learner by doing it on your phone. Your phone disciples you towards distraction and
Right.
restlessness. And so that's not to say you can't get something from it every now and then. It just means it's not forming you into the kind of learner that you could be if you do your learning in that medium. Now, if you apply this to discipleship, if they're getting phones out of schools, we should definitely get phones out of churches. I mean,
Right.
if they can see the learning outcomes so clearly in schools, we should go ahead and adopt that. And I'm not saying that every church needs to provide a rule. I just think we as church goers
Right.
need to have times, whether it's at church or, at home during the week, where we say this is spiritual time with God. So phones have no business being a part of it. And even if that's
Hmm.
more difficult because we're used to doing our content on our phone, it's worth it to say, I need this time away from a screen, away from a phone, away from distraction of any kind. Grow in that skill of being able to do that because it's actually really hard to do when you're used to being on your phone. Grow in the skill of being able to do that, to sit for, minutes at a time, let your mind wander, and then bring it back so that you can really focus, whether it's praying or reading or whatever you're doing. I think one of my takeaways is if they're going to get phones out of schools, we got to get phones out of our quiet times and out of our discipleship times.
No, I think that's true. I observe two things when I have a phone free time or phone free space. Let's say it's a worship service. And so we, turn the phone off or put it away or don't ever pick it up. Two things happen. One, you can become bored because it's not continuous stimulus for us. And so you boredom. And I think we as a people are afraid of boredom. We're afraid of just
Mm-hmm.
being with ourselves and not knowing what am I supposed to be doing? What am I supposed to be thinking about? And the second is an anxiety of being disconnected. Who's trying to reach me now? What's going on in the world? And I
Mm-hmm.
think those two things, I don't think we realize how close we are to addiction until we feel those two feelings. And I thought, I know my phone distracts me, but I'm not addicted. But when I turn it off for a couple of hours or go somewhere and leave it, I did that a while back. I actually didn't have my phone for a whole day. I had a lot of anxiety. Like, what am I missing? Who's trying to get a hold of me? And there were times when it's like, well, without my phone, what am I supposed to be doing? So I don't know. Have you ever experienced boredom or just that anxiety of being disconnected from the world?
Well, I think if you try to do this, you're going to experience that first. But
Yeah.
the promise is if you do that, it is kind of like a detoxing effect
Yeah.
of our phones. But after that, I think you'll realize that once you come out of it, you feel a million times better and more connected. In fact, taking this over to the addiction side of things, you certainly can be addicted. Although I think some people have pushed back on this and said maybe we should use the word compulsion
Right.
instead of addiction, habits maybe instead of addiction. I'm fine with that. I'm not, medically trained here, but I am
Hmm.
saying there is a very, very strong, if the definition of addiction is doing something despite harmful consequences to you and others, we'd have to put phones in that
This is
category for a
close.
lot
Yeah.
of people. But I read this book.
This is well, I just want to emphasize here something. This is just an anecdote from our lives. But when you boys were young and you were in school, so you were elementary age, we instituted a rule that we would do no television on Monday through Thursday nights. And so those were homework nights. But even after your homework was done, and the hard part was your mom and I said, well, that'd be hypocritical if we watch TV, so we won't. And, for the first couple of weeks, all of us struggled with that. There was a lot of whining and complaining. But after that couple of weeks, everybody was reading more. We were getting along better. I know other people have stories like this, and I wonder if you would update that now to phones, that it seems inconceivable that we might just not be on our phone Monday through Thursday evenings, but I wonder what would happen in our families if we weren't.
Yeah, I agree. As I say, I've read this book that has a lot of stories like that and is showing
Hmm.
that probably the best course of treatment for especially teenagers with their attitudes, anxiety, depression, even suicide ideation is to essentially impose a technology and phone fast for them for
Hmm.
weeks. And it actually takes a long time. It takes almost a month to really get back to an equilibrium. But it's proving to be really, really effective. And so in this book, Dopamine Nation by Anna Lembke, this was a fascinating and terrifying book to read. Maybe I'll put out a summary at some point uh, but there's a lot of good things here. So she is the medical director of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Program, and she is a psychiatrist. She sees patients, and she was talking about, over the last 3 decades, she says, I've had growing numbers of patients with every advantage in life, supportive families, quality education, financial stability, good health, yet they've developed debilitating anxiety, depression, and physical pain. Not only are they not functioning to their potential, they're barely able to get out of bed. And she gives an example of someone who comes to her, and it's a teenage girl, and she's coming basically presenting symptoms of depression and anxiety. And she said that she spends most of her waking hours plugged into some kind of device, Instagram, YouTube, podcasts, playlists, can never go without
Hmm.
it, basically avoiding boredom
Right.
at all costs.
Uh-huh.
So she says, in a session with her, I asked her to try walking to class without listening to anything and just letting her own thoughts bubble to the surface. She looked at me with both incredulous and afraid. Why would I want to do that? She asked. Well, I ventured, it's a way of becoming familiar with yourself, of letting your experience unfold without trying to control it or run away from it. All that distracting yourself with devices may be contributing to your depression and anxiety. It's pretty exhausting avoiding yourself all the time. I wonder if experiencing yourself in a different way might give you access to new thoughts and feelings and help you feel more connected to yourself, to others, and the world. She thinks about it for a moment and says, but that would be so boring. Yes, that's true, I said. Boredom is not just boring, it can also be terrifying. It forces us to come face to face with bigger questions of meaning and of purpose. But boredom is also an opportunity for discovery and invention. So she comes back a couple of weeks later, and she asks her, and she says, it was really, really hard at first, but then I got used to it. I even liked it. I started noticing trees,
Mm.
which I thought was interesting. That whole interchange I thought was really interesting. We're avoiding boredom at all costs, but actually avoiding boredom is one of the things that's making us miserable.
Right.
Which, to the addiction point, both she and Ted Gioia bring up the concept of anhedonia, which you might recognize the same root word where we get the word hedonism. Hedonism is the pursuit of pleasure, and anhedonia is the pursuit of pleasure that leads you to the point where you can't enjoy anything anymore. And I think this really is the deliverance of dopamine culture, is we can become so fixated on, dependent on, habituated to the scrolling and the hits of dopamine that come from social media or from your phone, that you actually become unable to enjoy anything else. You become so leveraged on that immediate pleasure that you can't wait for longer term pleasures, or
Right.
you're actually, there's a whole science about this in this book, Dopamine Nation, that was really interesting. Your whole body is now calibrated to that
Right.
in such a way that when you don't have it, you're actually in pain. It's actually really painful to not have it. And like we said, it takes a long time to get out of that. But what people consistently find is when they do, the things that should be and used to be enjoyable, having a conversation with somebody, having a moment of free time with nothing to do, looking at
Right.
trees, whatever it is, become enjoyable again. The body can adapt back. And I think, as the center of this discussion is on discipleship, how much could that help us in our discipleship if we realize that that were the case with our spiritual disciplines as well, or just, enjoying the world that God made as well?
I agree. The counterpart to this in the drug world, I've talked to quite a few people who were addicted to opioids. And at first, you get a very pleasurable experience out of it. But over time, as you continue to abuse that, it no longer gives you pleasure, but you take it to avoid withdrawal. And
Hmm.
so now it's anhedonia. You no longer have pleasure from it, but you're taking it to avoid the pain. And this is similar in a lesser way, and that is that I'm distracting myself to avoid boredom. It's no longer even necessarily pleasant to me. It's simply a way of avoiding what happens if I don't do it.
Yeah, if I could kind of wrap the articles, the books that we're talking about here, they all kind of point to this one conclusion that I think is a great takeaway for us. There's a lie at the center of our technology, whether it's our phones or all the other things that we've been mentioning. There's a lie at the center of that, that if you avoid things that are mildly difficult or boredom
Hmm.
or any kind of short-term pain, it will make you happier in a long run. So the key to happiness is to avoid unhappiness. But actually, what all of these point to is the way to be truly and deeply happy is to embrace a balance basically between enjoyment and difficulty, and to cultivate the enjoyment of deeper and longer term joys. And so,
Right.
one of the things that they point out is what's really good for your body that's really popular right now is like ice baths. And the reason for that is because doing something really difficult like that every day resets our expectation of what life is like. Being bored for a certain amount of time every day is really good because that's the kind of difficulty that then balances out enjoyment and wards off things like anhedonia. And not to say
Hmm.
that there isn't depression and anxiety outside of this, just to say the rates are absolutely skyrocketing in the American public right now, and many of these are coming back down when people deal with this other issue first. So if people think
Right.
they're embracing whatever kind of dopamine hit to treat the anxiety and the depression, but the anxiety and the depression are actually a consequence of this
Right.
lifestyle of quick hits and quick fixes. So, the solution for them is a little short-term pain will lead to a lot of long-term gain. Whereas the lie is avoid short-term pain and you'll have a lot of long-term happiness. And it turns out that just isn't the way that we were wired to be. Which kind of brings us back to some biblical takeaways. That kind of fits with what the Bible talks about, doesn't it?
It really does. I keep thinking of that passage, don't deceive yourselves. What you sow is what you'll reap. And if we sow inattention, that's what we will reap. And if we sow deep thinking, we will become deeper wells as a result. I just think that is very much a biblical principle.
Yeah, and I think of fasting. I mean, the biblical principle of
Right.
fasting is really key to this. You fast from things that you actually do love, that you actually do value for this greater purpose of communion with God,
Hmm.
prayer. We can do these for a lot of different reasons. The biblical way that we fast is to give up something that is good. This is so backwards from the
Right.
way that most people do Lent. Most people, a lot of times during Lent, they give up something that's actually bad. That's not a biblical fast. You should just give that up
That's just good sense.
anytime. But giving up something that is good, both for the sake of something greater, that kind of short-term pain for long-term gain, and for the enjoyment of that very thing over the long run. That's the biblical doctrine of why we fast, to enjoy God and to enjoy what God has given us and to appreciate it. We fast and we put our attention on Him. That's really, really good life advice. It's great spiritual advice, but it's also really, really great life advice, it turns out, to break the cycle that we find ourselves in with technology.
Yeah, the pursuit of constant comfort. And that's another Han book, by the way, The Palliative Society, which I also like that book. And he basically said, as we so pursue comfort, and we do so to the detriment of our own lives, is the irony is pursuing constant comfort and never having discomfort actually makes us weaker people.
Yeah, I'll add a last thought here. It occurred to me reading these articles that a lot of the popular people in our culture fall into a category of helping us break free from this. So if you think about like the Jordan Petersons of the world,
Right.
Joe
Right.
Rogans, they're all interested in doing difficult things, the small, difficult things, starting with making your bed, starting with
Hmm.
um, making something of yourself, embracing the short-term pain for long-term gain. And people love this because when they do it, they feel better. So
Right.
part of it is the proof is in the pudding because people that follow their advice actually do feel better. They amount to more, they have more confidence and all of that. And I would just step back and say, that's really helpful. And I would applaud that. But it's all in scripture. These principles are
Right.
all in scripture. And it's one of those ways that scripture is so timeless because on the surface, take up your cross and follow me doesn't sound like a method of dealing with your smartphone. But in fact, to bring this whole thing full circle, it is. Deny
Right.
yourself, take up your cross, follow me. Put in different language, the same way we used this Mary and Martha story earlier in the thing. Do the difficult thing now for the long-term
Right.
flourishing and enjoyment that God has designed you for is really good advice in the 30s AD and in the 2020s AD.
Amen.